That's Esther chapter 4, and we'll be beginning in verse number 13. Again, that's Esther chapter 4, verse number 13. And when you get your place, if you would please stand. Righty. The Bible says in Esther chapter 4, verse 13, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer, Go, gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, nor night or day. I also and my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. You may be seated. Okay, so tonight that's really just the introduction to what we're going to do, because Sebastian asked me earlier what I was going to be doing, and I told him I would be preaching an entire book, and he said, No, you're not, Bubba, and I said, Yes, I am. He said, No, you're not, and I said, Well, you'll see. So tonight what we're going to do is we're going to kind of walk through the book of Esther. I don't know if this will be quick or if it'll take a long time, but we're just going to see what happens. And if you don't know, Esther's an odd book because Esther never mentions God in it. Okay? And so essentially what we're going to be looking at is the unseen divine providence of God. So first things first, you kind of have to know what providence is. And so the easiest way that you can think of what providence is essentially just the divine care, guidance, and foresight of God. So what this means is that essentially he can take any of the tools at hand and accomplish his task, is the way I like to think about it. So even in the most unlikely of scenarios, he can do whatever he wants. And so whenever we're talking about this type of unseen divine providence, really what I'm looking at is even when you're hopeless or lonely or you feel alone, whether it's physically or spiritually, it's understanding that that providence, that all-present care of the Lord is always there. And so what we're going to see is that even though the Lord himself is never mentioned in the book of Esther, I think it's evident that whenever we go through it, we're going to see that the Lord has to be in this book or else it wouldn't even take place. Because whenever you look at it, Esther itself is a very unlikely book to occur whenever you take into account all of the events that happen. And so that's kind of what we're going to be looking at today, is literally the unseen divine providence that the Lord has. And so the way we're going to see this is really through the kind of redemption and deliverance arc that God sets for the Jews, okay? So, all that being said, I'm going to flip to chapter 1 of Esther, and I'm not going to read the whole book of Esther. I'll point out verses as we go along. But before anything else, you kind of need to know the background of what's going on in the Middle East during this time. So, as far as we're concerned, the book of Esther takes place roughly around 486 BC. So the way you can kind of think about this is it's just after David and the Lion's Den takes place and the second temple is dedicated. That's what I was looking for. So we have all this that's happened, and we have this main power that's present in the Middle East, and that's the Persian Empire. So over the course of the last semester, I was in a pirate history class, and we kind of looked at, I forget how far back we went. I want to say it was 4,000 BC, well, not 4,000 BC. I think it was around 2000 BC to about 1760 is where we stopped. And one of the largest empires that we ever looked at in this class was the Persian Empire. So if you don't know, the Persian Empire up until this point is really the largest empire in history, okay? To put it in perspective, They're not for sure, but the estimate is roughly 2.1 million square miles was the expanse of the Persian Empire. So if you take all of those little seas that are scattered across the Middle East and you kind of draw a big circle around all of them, that is the Persian Empire. That's also pretty much the known world up until this point. So we have a king, King Xerxes. He has a Hebrew name, Ahasuerus, which is his Hebrew name for King Xerxes. We have this man who's the ruler of all of this group of people, roughly about 50 million people in the Middle East. That's including his people, the Jewish people, that's all of them. And what we see is that whatever he says is going to impact the whole nation, okay? It's going to impact a lot of people. So starting out simply in verse 1, it says, "Now it came to pass in the days of Ahasuerus," this is Ahasuerus, "which reigned from India even unto Ethiopia, over 127 provinces." So what this essentially means is that he's the ruler of a bunch of different areas of land. So you have all of these mini sections, and then you have the king. And there's some debate over what he actually ruled, because some scholars say, well, there's no way that he actually ruled over this many groups of people. And whenever they start looking at it and they go into the Middle Eastern accounts that they found, really it's looking at all the subdivisions of land that he had under his belt, per se. So that's kind of how you can think about this, and it'll be important as we go along, because what you have to notice, what's going to happen to the Jews is going to put them in a dire situation, because all of their land is essentially ruled by one king. So whatever that one king says is going to impact all of the known Jews, okay? So it's necessarily very important. So whenever we're looking at this, we simply see the establishment of this kingdom. And then as we further go through chapter number 1, and I'm just going to start saying verses every now and then. Verses 2 through 9, we kind of see where a bunch of feasts are taking place in the city, okay? So you have a 180-day-long feast or festival kind of celebration where King Ahasuerus is essentially showing off the kingdom to all of, not necessarily suitors, but the princes, those that have invested in his kingdom. He's simply showing how rich the Persian Empire is, okay? And then after this kind of 180-day display of just how powerful the Persian Empire is, then he goes, okay, well, I've displayed it to the princes, to our investors, so to speak. Now let's actually open up this celebration to everybody. So then he throws a 7-day festival for all of the Persians, all of those that are in the Persian Empire. And at the same time, his wife, his queen, Vashti, she's going to throw a banquet, per se, for all of the women that are in the royal house. So Xerxes had a lot of wives, concubines, whatever you want to call it. She's going to throw essentially a party for all of them, okay? Now, this is going to be one big, long story, so you're just going to have to stay with it. But essentially, she throws this party. Now, she's busy during this party. I don't know what she's doing. I guess she's attending the guests. And we see that in verses 10 through 12, something happens, okay? So King Xerxes he's drunk. He's drunken with wine. And he essentially calls in Vashti to show off herself to the men that are present, okay? Well, she refuses his request. And nobody liked it, okay? None of the princes, Xerxes, none of them liked it. And so that's essentially what starts off this kind of snowball effect that will give us the story that we have. So Vashti, she declined the offer to come in and basically attend to Xerxes. And so we have verse 16 come into play, and I'll read verse 16 of chapter 1. And it says, "And Memucan," that's one of the princes, "answered before the king and the princes, Vashti the queen hath not done wrong to the king only, but also to all the princes and to all the people that are in the provinces of the king Ahasuerus." So essentially what he's saying is, Xerxes, yes, Vashti dishonored you, but she's also dishonored all the princes, all the people. And so we need to do something about it, okay? So he's on the side of, okay, Vashti's in the wrong, we need to do something. And so what happens is, what we're going to see is, well, the idea that Memucan puts forth here as we kind of look in between the lines is that he essentially wants to get rid of Vashti. Not necessarily kill her, but he wants the king to basically divorce her, get rid of all her stuff, kick her out, and then put a law into place, essentially stating, kind of putting more power towards the patriarchal society, where women can't rise up against their husbands and such and so forth. So what this is doing is they're afraid that a rebellion will start because of Vashti, but oh well, let's just get rid of her, put some laws into place, and try to protect against it. So that's exactly what happens. He follows through with Memucan's kind of suggestion, and what we see is Vashti being punished. So between chapter 1, verse 13, and chapter 2, verses 4, we see where Vashti is actually punished here. So she's kicked out. He no longer has a wife. And essentially, once this is done, they're kind of celebrating. And the servants of the king's household basically say, okay, Xerxes, it's been a little while since you've had a wife. We've had a queen. So why don't you go find another wife? So they suggest that essentially he goes, and I don't know if you would call it a beauty pageant or what you would call it, but essentially what's going to happen is all of the provinces, the 127 that he has, they're basically going to all submit virgins for Xerxes, and they're going to come and present themselves, and then he's going to choose out of everybody that's there. So looking at chapter number 2, verse 4, it says, "And let the maiden which pleaseth the king be queen instead of Vashti. And the thing pleased the king, and he did so. Now in Shushan the palace there was a certain Jew, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, a Benjamite, who had been carried away from Jerusalem with the captivity which had been carried away with Genokai, the king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, had carried away. And he brought up Hadash, that is, Esther, his uncle's daughter, for she had neither father nor mother, and the maid was fair and beautiful, whom Mordecai, when her father and mother were dead, took for his own daughter." Okay, so a lot's going to happen, but essentially what we see here is that the wrath of the king was pacified. So he put on this display, and he's inviting all of the girls to the palace, okay? So the king is the first main character that you see, the one that's in power. The second two are introduced in the beginning of chapter 2, and that's going to be Mordecai and Esther, okay? So Mordecai, essentially, he's the uncle. He's the guardian for Esther, so she has no family, and so Mordecai takes her in. His name is actually from the Babylonian name, Morduka, or it's got another name, but that's the main Babylonian name. So he was named during the Babylonian times, Babylonian captivity, so when the Israelites were, I guess, in cohorts with Babylonians, you could say that's where his name comes from. And then we also have Esther, who here has two names. We have Hadash and we have Esther. So Hadash is actually her Hebrew name, and that simply means myrtle tree. So essentially her myrtle tree name is kind of signifying her beauty. It's also kind of looking at her prosperity and her righteousness. So as we'll go and come to find out, Esther was a beautiful girl, and that's one of the reasons that the king liked her so much. And then we also have her Gentile name, so Esther, and that name actually means star. So one thing I would just point out is that kind of the beginning of any journey always starts with a star. And whenever you look at Jesus, you kind of see how his journey started with the star in Bethlehem and the wise men following it. Now, we won't necessarily look at the parallels entirely between Esther and Jesus, but if you look, there are parallels of kind of their journey that they take. And I would point out this is one of them, and that the providence of God always starts with a star. It's always going to be that light at the end of the tunnel that people will wind up following. So there's kind of the first step of providence, is that providence does have an end goal. If it didn't have an end goal, it wouldn't be providence, because it wouldn't be foresight. So that's why God's providence is unfailing. So we see this situation between Esther and Mordecai take place. It introduces us to them. And then further along, what we see take place is we actually see the competition happen. So between chapter 2, verses 8 through 20, we see this competition play out where all of the ladies will come forth, they'll go talk to Xerxes for a little while, They'll present themselves, take things. They'll also make requests. Esther doesn't really make a request like all of the other women here. But essentially, the bottom line is we see in verse 17 of chapter 2, it says, "And the king loved Esther above all the women, and she obtained grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown upon her head and made her queen instead of Vashti." So already we kind of see this unlikely scenario taking place, okay? So a Jewish lady has just inherited the throne. Now, granted, the king does not know that she's Jewish. So Mordecai charged her and basically said, do not tell anybody that you're Jewish, okay? Now, of course, I'm assuming that her friends and everybody would know that she was Jewish. But as far as in the king's castle goes, nobody should know you're Jewish. And that's actually very important as we see going down the line. And I just want you to kind of try to keep in your mind everything that's happening, because everything that's happening in the book of Esther will usually occur twice or 3 times, and it's because what's happened once is going to be fulfilled later. So there's a reason why she hasn't told everybody that she's a Jew. And there's also a reason why I'm saying that there still are people that know she's a Jew, okay? I hope it'll make sense as we go along. But essentially, this is kind of setting the stage for how the Lord will deliver the Jews in the end. Another thing that's setting the stage here is actually going to happen with Mordecai. So we have this competition take place, and Esther's crowned queen, okay? Well, not long after Esther becomes the queen, we have another situation take place. So Mordecai hangs out at the king's gate a lot, okay? He's seen there. I don't know what his actual role is, but evidently he's doing something because he's looking out for the king, he's working with the servants, things like that. And so whenever we look at the end of chapter 2, verses 21 through 23 say, "In those days, while Mordecai sat in the king's gate, 2 of the king's chamberlains, Bigthan and Teresh, of those which kept the door, were wroth and sought to lay hand on King Ahasuerus. And the thing was known to Mordecai, who told it unto Esther the queen. And Esther certified the king thereof in Mordecai's name. And when inquisition was made of the matter, it was found out. Therefore they were both hanged on a tree, and it was written in the book of the Chronicles before the king." So this is important because without this scenario, I don't think the rest of the book, I think up until about chapter 6 it would happen, but I don't think the Jews would fully be delivered, okay? Because there's a few things that are very important in this situation. Firstly, I want you to note that whenever we're looking at this, one, it's going to help Esther and the king's relationship, okay? So they've not necessarily been together long, is my guess. And I would also guess that if she's willing to go and tell about an assassination to the king, that it would have to strengthen their bond somehow. So all throughout this book, we'll find where Esther has found favor in the sight of the king, which is a big deal because if you show up unannounced, you're dead, essentially. And it's all hinged on this idea of unlikely circumstances. So she tells the king his assassination is thwarted. Another thing that you have to note is that his name was written in the book of Chronicles. So essentially everything that goes down in this empire is going to be written in this book if it matters. And another thing that you don't see happening is Mordecai is not right away thanked for not letting the king get killed. Okay? So essentially it's kind of written and forgot about. The king certifies it, and he knows what Mordecai had told Esther that Esther told the king is true. He knows that it was true, but he never actually goes to Mordecai and says thank you. So all of that happens, and then chapter 3 kind of turns a little bit and introduces the fourth and really final main character of the book of Esther, and that's Haman. So essentially, if you want to sum up chapter 3, you can sum it up as Haman hating the Jews, okay? So as we're going to go along, we're going to see where essentially Mordecai does wrong towards Haman, and Haman hates all of the Jews because of it. And so this is going to start a cascade of downfall for the Jews. So first things first, Haman comes into power between verses 1 and 3 of chapter 3. And So essentially what happens is we have all of these princes in the empire, but nobody's really in between the princes and the king. So what happens is the king takes Haman and he puts him as kind of that middleman. So he's going to be a second-hand man. He gives him a ring. He gives him all of this power, money, wealth, fame. And he says, okay, you're my second-hand man. Pretty much what we're going to see is that anything that Haman says, the king is going to go, thank you. Sure, I'll sign off on it, because Haman will be one of his trusted advisors. And with this ring, it's kind of symbolizing this transfer of power. It's that I trust you. And it's going to be important as we go along. And so, because the king has esteemed Haman so much, he basically gives him so much power that he says, okay, I want everybody to bow to you like they do to me. And so what we're going to see is that essentially Mordecai is not going to bow towards Haman. So verses 2 and 3 say, and all the king's servants that were in the king's gate bowed and reverenced Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him. But Mordecai bowed not, nor did him reverence. Then the king's servants which were in the king's gate said unto Mordecai, why transgressest thou against the king's commandment? So essentially what we see is that Mordecai doesn't bow to the king. And Mordecai doesn't bow to Haman, which was ordered by the king. So essentially what we see is while Haman doesn't necessarily find out, gossip amongst the servants causes Haman to find out. And so Haman gets mad. And what ends up happening is that Haman's going to start hating all of the Jews, okay? So one event caused everything. And as you see, verse number 8 says, and Haman said unto the king Ahasuerus, there is a certain people scattered abroad and dispersed amongst the people in all the provinces of thy kingdom, and their laws are diverse from all people. Neither keep they the king's laws. Therefore, it is not for the king's profit to suffer them. So, essentially what we have happening here is we have Haman kind of being sneaky, okay? He doesn't come straight out and say that the Jews are terrible. He says there's a group of people that are breaking your laws. So, he doesn't name who he wants to go after, and he's also not really saying anything that they're doing other than they're breaking your laws. Now, because the king trusts him, what we're going to see is essentially he's just going to sign off. So Haman is going to offer up a couple things. He's essentially going to offer the right for anybody to kill a Jew. Okay, he's going to just open up the floodgates to where if you see a Jew, you can kill them. And then the second part is that Haman is offering to pay the king for every Jew that's turned in. I don't know how Haman has that much money, but that's evidently what's the case. And another thing that's kind of mentioned here is that the coffers of the king would have been kind of empty at this time from wars and things that have happened not long before this. And so it would kind of seem like an offer you can't turn down, because if somebody's going to give you free money to exterminate a pest, then why wouldn't you accept it? So that's kind of what the king goes along with. And verse 13 says, and the letters were sent by posts into all the king's provinces to destroy, to kill, and to cause to perish all Jews, both young and old, little children and women, in one day, even upon the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month Adar, and to take the spoil of them for prey. So essentially, if there's a Jew, they are free reign. Now this is very important because we all know that Jesus comes from the Jewish lineage. So if this is going to happen, and Persia, or the Persian Empire, is over all of the known world, and all of the Jews are in all of the known world, and a decree sent out that any Jew inside of this territory can be killed, there's a good chance that the vast majority of your Jews, if not all of them, are going to be exterminated. All because of one event where Mordecai wouldn't bow to Haman. Now, I'm sure we could all agree that that's wrong, but it's something that happened. And so what we see is that times are going to get pretty turbulent in the Jewish Empire as far as what's happening for them. And without the intervention of God, then there's a likelihood that Jesus' lineage could have been wiped out. So without the divine providence here, we may not even have Jesus whenever you think about it. So that's how high the stakes are. And so with the stakes being so high, we then come to chapter 4, which could be looked at as the plight of the Jews. So what's happening with the Jewish people? So verses 1 through 3 say, when Mordecai perceived all that was done, Mordecai rent his clothes and put on sackcloth with ashes, and went out into the midst of the city, and cried with a loud and bitter cry, and came even before the king's gate, for none might enter into the king's gate clothed with sackcloth. And in every province, whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, there was great mourning among the Jews, and fasting and weeping and wailing, and many lay in sackcloth and ashes. So we essentially see a broken people. They all know that if something does not happen, they're either going to have to run for their lives or they're going to be killed. There's really no two options here. See, another thing about this is that this law does not spare anybody. And what I mean is that it doesn't spare anybody even in the king's cabinet. So if there's a Jew that's high ranking, they could still kill that Jew. Now, if you remember, Esther's just been crowned queen. So of course, Mordecai is probably crying because, well, my daughter is in the midst of the enemy's camp, literally. So I'm sure he's crying because of that. Another reason that he's most likely crying, I wonder if he thought that all of this was because of him. Because I'm sure that he figured out, since he was always at the king's gate, that Haman is the one who had all this arranged. So I'm wondering if he's upset and crying because of that. Also, it's here to signify that he is also kind of bearing the weight and resembling all of the Jewish people. That's kind of understood here. So he's crying in a public place, he's wailing, but he shouldn't necessarily be in sackcloth at the king's gate. That's not good. That's putting himself in danger. But he's distraught. I mean, what else would you do other than go cry if everybody you loved and known was going to die? So that's what we have here, is we have him laying at the king's gate crying. Now, of course, Esther's going to hear about this. And one thing that happened during the kind of hunt for a new queen, Esther would walk by as close as he could to try to check in on Esther, okay? So they would have communication even though they weren't around each other all the time. Well, what we're going to see is that Esther was still keeping in touch with Mordecai even though they weren't necessarily close. So they actually used one of her chamberlains. Her name was Hatchet. And essentially what they would do is they would kind of pass notes, okay? So there's several times throughout where they pass notes before they're actually reunited in the end of the book. And what we see here is that essentially what they're going to do first off is talk about how bad the Jews are, like how bad off they are. And as we kind of walk through this, we're going to see where they kind of have to make a game plan, okay? So verse 11 says, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces do know that whosoever, whether man or woman, shall come into the king, into the inner court, who is not called, there is one law of his to put him to death, except such to whom the king shall hold out the golden scepter, that he may live, but I have not been called to come in unto the king these 30 days. So essentially, this is one of the notes that's kind of going to go back and forth between Esther and Mordecai. And first off, this is going to put Mordecai at ease somewhat because she's not been in contact with the king, okay, for 30 days. She's not seen him, which is a good thing and a bad thing because it makes you wonder, well, is the king suspicious of her, which could be a likelihood. I mean, you never know who's talked to the king. Another thing is that, well, did something happen between them and she's losing her power because she could possibly be a route to salvation for the Jews. You never know what's happening. It also comes into play because she says that if you're not announced whenever you go in, or if you're not invited into the king's presence, then that's another reason for him to kill you. So you don't want to show up uninvited, and you don't want to be called in unless you're invited. So you kind of have this situation to where, well, I need to talk to the king, but if I go talk to him without trying to set up a meeting, then who knows what will happen. So what we happen is this kind of dilemma, okay? So then Mordecai answers in verse 13, and this was really one of the only times that we see a hint at the providence of God actually being laid out, okay? This is the closest we get to the Lord being mentioned in the book of Esther. So verse number 13 says, Then Mordecai commanded to answer Esther, Think not with thyself that thou shalt escape in the king's house more than all the Jews. For if thou altogether holdest thy peace at this time, then shall their enlargement and deliverance arise to the Jews from another place. But thou and thy father's house shall be destroyed. And who knoweth whether thou art come to the kingdom for such a time as this? So there's a couple things happening here. First off, he's saying you're not better off than any other Jew because you're in the enemy's camp. He's also saying that, well, you know that other Jews know that you're a Jew, so, well, they could rat you out. But it also says that you need to hold your peace because deliverance is going to come from somewhere, okay? Well, that somewhere, of course, is the Lord because that's the only person that can deliver them out of such a dire situation. And so what we see here is he's essentially going to say, keep the peace, trust in the Lord, is what he's kind of alluding at. And I often wonder if the Lord's not mentioned here because it could put her in jeopardy if they're actually talking in broad terms. Because if somebody was to stop the messenger, then everybody's caught. So I wonder if that's another reason why they're so cryptic whenever they're talking. But essentially, enlargement and deliverance will arise for the Jews from somewhere, is what he's saying. That somewhere is going to be the Lord. And he's also saying, well, what if you're come to the kingdom for such a time as this? Okay, like, what if you have a purpose? Well, as we're going to find out, she definitely has a purpose, okay? And whenever you read verses 15 through 17, it says, Then Esther bade them return Mordecai this answer, Go gather together all the Jews that are present in Shushan, and fast ye for me, and neither eat nor drink 3 days, night or day. I also with my maidens will fast likewise, and so will I go in unto the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went his way and did according to all that Esther had commanded him. So we've seen here that essentially Mordecai's told her to trust in the Lord without telling her to trust in the Lord. And so that's exactly what she's going to do. So they're going to fast. She's going to try to arrange to where all the people in Shushan, that's the capital, if I didn't say that already, she's going to try to get all of the Jews here to fast, okay? Now, fasting is pretty common for the Jewish people, but fasting for 3 days, night and day, is not as common. But the reason here they're fasting so long and so stern is because of how dire the situation is. That's essentially why she's saying everybody needs to fast this long, because it's important. And so what we see here is she says, well, after everybody's fasted and prayed, then I'm going to go to the king. Now, she doesn't necessarily say what she's going to tell the king. She just says, I'm going to the king unannounced. That's bad, but it's okay. She's keeping the peace, or at least she's going to try to. And so she says, if I perish, I perish. Now, that phrase could be confusing because it's kind of like she's writing her own death note, is what most people think. But I liked how M. Fox stated this. So talking about the statement, it says, this statement does not suggest a person seeking out an escape route, but one facing and coming to grips with the danger. The statement recognizes the possibility of failure, yet also expresses the hope, though not certainty, of success. So essentially, she's just having faith, because faith is taking that step towards the danger. You don't necessarily know for certain that it'll work out, but you have to have faith that it will work out. And see, that's kind of the step as far as looking at providence. You have to have that understanding that the providence of God is there. You just have to take that step of blind faith, walk through the danger, whatever it may be, and He will deliver you in the end if you're His. So that's what she's going to bank on. I like the verses from Psalms 18, 2 and 3. It says, The Lord is my rock and my fortress, my deliverer, my God, my strength, in whom I will trust, my buckler and the horn of my salvation and my high tower. I will call upon the Lord who is worthy to be praised, so shall I be saved from mine enemies. I think that's, I doubt she had Psalms, but I think that's kind of what it's emphasizing here, is that she's going to trust in the Lord, she's going to pray, she's going to exalt, and then she's going to walk into the danger. There's nothing else she can do other than thank the Lord and then go. So that's exactly what she's going to do. And I think if she would have had a verse from the New Testament that she could kind of read, it would have been Romans 8:31. What shall we say then to say to these things? If God be for us, who can be against us? I think if she had that verse, she would have been like, let's go. Now, she don't have that verse, so she's got to live that verse out. You know, she doesn't have anybody necessarily telling her what to do. She's just having to walk the path and see what happens. Now, Mordecai's told her to keep the peace, but even Mordecai doesn't know everything that's going on. There's still many unanswered questions happening. So, this is kind of the foreshadowing and the only true close glimpse we get of God in this passage that's just stated. So then you move on to chapter 5, and it's kind of the day before is what I call this chapter. So on the third day of fasting, Esther goes to the king. Esther goes to the king, and she says, hello, king. The king holds out his scepter to her. That's a check, number one, because that means he doesn't know she's a Jew. He's not going to kill her right away. She still has favor with him, even though she's not seen him in 33 days now. That's good. That's good for Esther. So she's got the first check mark of, I've walked through the gate and I'm not dead already. So now let's see what happens. Well, ironically, she's going to invite him and Haman to a feast. Okay, that evening. Just spur of the moment, let's go eat. Okay. Good and bad? Sure. I think it's ironic that through the book of Esther, the Lord works through these feasts and things because that's where everything bad also happens. So that's where Vashti didn't show up, and then that spiraled, and then we're going to have more feasts and more things are going to happen. So I think it's ironic that the Lord's working through these feasts. And they're also not godly feasts. See, usually what they would do is they would just come together and they would drink. So that was kind of the Persian idea of the feast here. So what's going to happen is she's going to come and she's going to say, okay, I'm going to have this banquet of wine, is how it's mentioned in the scripture, and we're going to talk. Okay, cool. Well, later that evening, they go and they get Haman, the servants do, they get Haman. Haman comes. He's thrilled to be invited to the king's court because even though he is the second in command, he still wants more power, more glory. We're going to see that unfold. But he's thrilled. He's here. He's getting to eat with the king and his queen. So, good for Haman. Well, because it's an unannounced feast, of course the king's a little suspicious of what's happening. So he essentially asks Esther, okay, what's wrong? What do you want? Nobody throws a feast or gives a present without wanting something in return if it's just unannounced usually. So he's asked, well, what's wrong? What's your petition? Well, she petitions for another feast the very next day. That's ironic. So he essentially says, okay. So what happens is, good for Haman, good for the king, good for Esther. Everybody's agreed and everybody's on good terms. Well, as soon as Haman leaves, of course Haman has to walk by the gate to get to his house. Well, Mordecai's at the gate. Mordecai doesn't even tremble or shake or bow or anything to Haman. That's bad. It ruins Haman's day. Haman's mad. He's furious. So what happens? Well, I think one thing that this is showing us is that even in times of trouble, we see that there's not a need to compromise because you're on God's side. See, Mordecai, I don't know how much lineage they knew of Mordecai, because if they could connect Mordecai and Esther, then they would probably understand that she's Jewish. But I have a feeling that they knew he was a Jew. I just have that feeling for some reason. Also, because Haman hasn't been bowed to, and this is the second occurrence, he's seen him face to face not do this, he could have killed Mordecai right then and there. But he doesn't. Instead, he leaves, Haman goes home to his wife, and he rants, okay? Essentially what he's doing here is that he's ranting to his wife, his children, and they're conspiring against Haman and the Jewish people. Well, his wife comes out and she suggests that he builds this 50-cubit high gallows for him to be hung on. Well, 50 cubits, that's 75 feet tall, so she's essentially saying, we need to make a statement. We need to show everybody what happens to the Jewish people if they cross you. She's wanting to solidify her husband's stance, try to bring more honor in the sight of the king. good for them, I think. Well, so that happens, and so he says, okay, well, let's make the gallows. So that's what he does. He gets his men set on the gallows. I don't know how long it took them to make this gallows, but it was very fast, because it's not going to be long before the tables will be turned. And so what happens is, kind of everything that's necessarily bad has happened up until this point. So, of course, the letters are sent out for the Jews, and all that's happening. But as far as like turmoil in the king's court, it's kind of all kept under a rug. Well, that's still going to be the case, but things are going to improve for Mordecai. So chapter number 6 is really where we see God's plan start to unfold for the Jewish people. So essentially, I don't know why, but the king woke up during that night while he was asleep. And we see that starting in verse 1 of chapter 6. It says, "On that night could not the king sleep, and he commanded to bring the book of records of the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. And it was found written that Mordecai had told of Bigthana and Teresh, two of the king's chamberlains, the keepers of the door, who sought to lay hand on the king Ahasuerus. And the king said, What honor and dignity hath been done to Mordecai for this? Then said the king's servants that ministered unto him, There is nothing done for him." Now, you can't tell me that a man would randomly not be able to sleep and seek out the specific book without it being for a purpose. The only purpose I can think of is the Lord. I mean, correct me if you think I'm wrong. But clearly he's seeking out this book for a reason that even he doesn't know, because he can't sleep, so he's just trying to find out what's wrong. Why else would you go to a history book in the middle of the night to start reading? That's not comforting for anybody. So he opens the history book. He opens the Chronicles, and he starts reading. He finds out that Mordecai, this man that's at the gate all the time, he's the one that saved him. Okay, what's been done for him? Nothing. Why is that important? Well, because something's going to happen for Mordecai now, because the king knows that man wasn't paid. That's essentially what's happening. So then what we see is, well, because Mordecai did not have any reward, restitution for saving the king, somebody's going to have to take that reward to him. So what happens? The next morning, what happens? Well, Haman's called in, or Haman's found in the king's court. And so the king goes, "Hey, Haman, if there was a man that the king delighteth in, how should I reward him?" Haman, being Haman, he's thinking, oh, he's about to reward me because I'm second in command. He knows it's just me. That's what he's thinking. He's thinking, I've got the money, I've got the power, now I'm going to get the glory. So what does he say? Well, he says, well, let's array this random man in the king's garments. He says, let's take the king's clothes and put them on him. Okay? What else? Well, let's get the king's horse, and let's put this man on the king's horse. Okay? Let's get the princes, or a prince, to lead him about the city and show him off to all the people. Okay, we got it. So, what happens? Well, the king says, okay, go do it for Mordecai. I would have loved to have seen Haman's face when he said that, because you know his heart sunk. You know it had to sink so bad, because that's what Haman wanted. He wanted all of that for himself, and then the king said, nope, it's not for you, it's for Mordecai. Mordecai saved my life. Oh no. Okay, so what happens? Well, what we see is essentially Haman has to go do it. Okay? So Haman goes out and he shows Mordecai about the city. Well, Mordecai is being repaid right here. Now, I don't know how Haman felt as far as during it. We know afterwards he was very mad. He was also sad. I think he was sad mad. But what happens is, in verses 12 through 14, we kind of see the aftermath of him showing Mordecai about the city. And it says, And Mordecai came again to the king's gate, but Haman hasted to his house mourning, and having his head covered. And Haman told Zeresh his wife, and all his friends everything that had befallen him. Then said his wise men and Zeresh's wife unto him, If Mordecai be of the seed of the Jews, before whom thou hast begun to fall, thou shalt not prevail against him, but shalt surely fall before him. And while they were yet talking with him, came the king's chamberlains and hasted to bring Haman unto the banquet that Esther had prepared. He's sad. And basically, he's realizing his defeat. That's kind of what's happening. So all of his friends, his wife that said, okay, go kill this man, they've already flipped the tables and say, you're done for. You have no chance if he's with the Jews. I don't know if that's because they're realizing who the God of the Jews is. I don't know what it is. It may simply be because of how much the king is favoring Mordecai in this moment, that he says, well, if you're going against Mordecai and Mordecai's growing and climbing the ladder, you're done for. I don't know. But the thing is, they're realizing that the tide is changing. The Jews are starting to gain power. That's kind of what this is. But they don't know how much the Jews have actually gained in power up until this point. See, while all this has been happening, while the Lord's been raising up Mordecai, kind of, I don't know about drawing a distraction, but rather just putting Mordecai in the favor of the king, he's also been working with Esther. So, what's happening with Esther? Well, Haman was just called to a feast. This is the second feast. If you eat with somebody twice for the same issue, the issue's probably important, because she told the king that she would tell him tonight what the big deal is. So what happens? Well, starting in verse number 1 of chapter 7. So the king and Haman came to banquet with Esther the queen, and the king said unto Esther on the second day at the banquet of wine, What is thy petition, Queen Esther? And it shall be granted thee. And what is thy request? And it shall be performed, even to the half of the kingdom. Then Esther the queen answered and said, If I have found favor in thy sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be given me at my petition, and let my people at my request. For we are sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be slain, and to perish. But if we had been sold for bondmen and bondwomen, I had held my tongue, although the enemy could not countervail the king's damage. So, there's a lot happening here. But essentially what the queen's saying is that somebody sold me and my people out. Somebody's out to get us. She says, well, if they would have just put us into slavery, I would have stayed quiet. That's what she's saying whenever she's talking about the bondsman. She's saying, if we were going to be slaves and at least live, I wouldn't have said nothing. But they're not. They're going to die. She also says, another thing about this, King, I don't think you realize how many workers, how many people you're going to lose. That's the expensive loss if you lose all of the Jews. I mean, the Jewish nation's a big group of people, and if they're all in this Persian Empire, taking out an entire group of people is going to knock out a big economic funder. I think she also probably knows about that little offer that Haman had for the king. See, the king refused it. I don't know if the king knew then, but she's definitely opening the king's eyes that it's going to even cost you money to get rid of all these people. So, the king goes, well, that's new. See, I also find it interesting that the king still doesn't know she's a Jew here. She's still hiding that fact of her life. I know the king has to know that the Jewish people are the ones that are dying, and so he's probably connecting the dots. But she doesn't say who her people is, just like Haman didn't say who the people was that he wanted killed. So what happens? Well, the king starts to get mad. And he says, well, who sold you out? And she points the finger across the table at Haman. Oh no, another thing bad happening at a meal. So, what do we see? Well, essentially, Haman's caught. He's caught red-handed in the midst of the king and everybody. So, of course, Haman's coming after the queen, so the king's going to get mad. He gets so mad that he walks outside, walks through the garden, and he goes off, right? I don't know if he's trying to not make a rash decision and just execute Haman right there. I don't know. But he goes outside. Well, as soon as he goes outside, guess what Haman does? Haman falls onto Esther's bed, well, her couch that they're laying on, because they lay on these couches while they eat and drink. He falls on the couch and starts begging Esther for his life, trying to turn her around, get her on his side. Oh no, here comes the king. He walks back in, sees him on her bed, and then he's even more mad. One thing I found out is that in the Persian Empire, especially in the royal court, a man is not supposed to be within 7 feet of a woman. He was literally at her feet. So, oh well. What happens? Well, he says, you're to be executed. So they cover his head and they take him out. Where do they take him? Well, Funny thing is, the king also happens to find out that Haman wanted to kill Mordecai. How did he want to kill Mordecai? On that 75-foot tall noose. So what does he say? Haman, you've prepared your own deathbed. So he's hung on Mordecai's gallows. Okay, so the enemy's been vanquished, right? Well, everything's still going to happen bad unless Esther can get the king to do something about all those letters. So what does she do? Well, the Jews are restored really in chapters 8 and 9. So in chapter 8, we see where, well, let's back up. In chapter 7, we see where the king was willing to give Esther half of the kingdom. Whether it's literally or figuratively, it doesn't matter. It just shows how much he trusted her, how much he was willing to sacrifice for Esther. She had found favor. Well, in chapter 8, she falls at the king's feet. And the king says, what's your request? See, even though she's already been given the scepter and it's been held out towards her, he holds the scepter out again. That's just going above and beyond what he's willing to do for Esther. And so what happens? Well, verse number 7 of chapter 8 says, Then the king Ahasuerus said unto Esther the queen, and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and him have they hanged upon the gallows, because he laid his hand upon the Jews. Write ye also for the Jews as it liketh you, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's ring, for the writing which is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's ring may no man reverse. I think this is ironic because Haman, while he had the king's ring, he didn't necessarily have the approval to just seal anything with the king's ring. Now, of course, the king approved of it and sent it out, but he's literally saying, I will sign whatever you write. She could have wrote anything into existence right here with the scribes. It would have been signed. Well, what does she say? Essentially, she wants the letters to be rescinded. She wants protection for her people, and she wants her people to be able to go after the people that are going after them. She wants protection both now and in the future. See, that's another thing that people don't realize with the Lord is that He makes plans for right now, but He also makes plans along the whole way. And while we can't necessarily see 2 feet in front of our faces sometimes, everything's happening for a reason. See, she's been held out that scepter more times than anybody I would bet has up until this point. Because evidently the king's pretty jealous, yes. He's also pretty tempered if he gets that mad. So she's been shown favor. That's unlikely. It also comes out that she's a Jew. That decree's still technically in play right here. He could have had her executed if he really wanted to just get rid of her. So all of the pieces are lining up. She also is given the house of Haman, and that ring that Haman had been given a ring by the king. Well, Haman's ring was actually given to Mordecai. Esther set Mordecai over Haman's house. So Mordecai has essentially inherited everything of Haman's. Mordecai is going to now become the second in command. Esther's the queen. So now we have 2 very powerful Jews in this society. So what happens? Well, verse number 11 says, Wherein the king granted the Jews which were in every city to gather themselves together, and to stand for their life, to destroy, to slay, and to cause to perish all power of the people and providence that would assault them, both little ones and women, and to take the spoil of them for a prey. And then verse 15 says, And Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal apparel of blue and white, and with a great crown of gold, and with a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Shushan rejoiced and was glad. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor, and in every province and in every city whithersoever the king's commandment and his decree came, the Jews had joy and gladness, a feast and a good day. And many of the people of the land became Jews, for the fear of the Jews fell upon them. So what's happening? Well, the Jews have won. That's essentially what's happening. The Jews have been enlarged, that's being fulfilled, and they're being delivered, that's being fulfilled. So everything that we see Mordecai saying a couple of chapters ago, it's happening. So people are turning sides. They're joining the Jews. They're essentially fleeing because the Jews have the power now. What's also going to happen is, well, we're going to see that the Jews, they fully act on what's been given them. So what does that mean? Well, whenever you look, it's going to mean that they're going to go out and they're going to slay 500 people in Shushan alone. That's only one province, okay? Now, 500 out of 50 million is not that much. But it's still going to make waves, because if they're going to do this in the capital city where the king is, then it's definitely going to happen everywhere else. So we see the expanse of the Jews happening. They're getting power. Mordecai is being raised up. And so everything's happening like Mordecai said. And it's happening pretty quickly. You know, I would also remind you that Psalms 30 verse 5 says, "For his anger endureth but a moment, in his favor is life. Weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning." See, for Mordecai and the Jewish people, that's literally the case. They didn't know how. They had no clue where this was going to come from. I mean, it used Mordecai, it used Esther, it used everything that was at the disposal. The Lord just took all the tools and put them all together miraculously. It just happened that way. See, that's how the Lord works a lot of times. That He'll use broken pieces. He'll use pieces that have been cast off to the side. He'll use one person, or He'll use thousands, and He'll accomplish it. See, that's His divine providence and care that goes way beyond what we can see. Even in the moments when everything's falling apart, that's why it's important to remember that He does have that divine providence, because it gives you hope. It gives you that, I can do this. I would also say that chapter 9 is also a time of celebration. So whenever people realize the providence of the Lord and how far it actually goes, they tend to celebrate. Verse 22 says, as the days wherein the Jews rested from their enemies, and the month which was turned unto them from sorrow to joy, and from mourning unto a good day, that they should make them days of feasting and joy, and of sending portions one to another, and gifts to the poor. So, what's happening? Essentially, they're going to have a festival. They're going to celebrate forever. And if you look at verse 26, you'll see what that is. It says, "Wherefore they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, for all the words of this letter, and of that which they had seen concerning this matter, and to which had come unto them." Essentially what we're going to see is that everything's been fulfilled for the Jews. They're going to rejoice. What I kind of want to come back to is kind of ending on this note. The Lord's path is not random, okay? People will say that basically predictable results come from randomness, okay? Now, in real life, that doesn't happen, okay? You can't just take random things and get necessarily order. But what you have to realize is that without the providence of the Lord, He can't synthesize down whatever happens into one straight line. See, Haman, a while ago, before he was executed, before he even went after Mordecai, he cast lots, okay? He was trying to just find a random date that was ordained by some power to go kill Mordecai. Well, here, this is the festival of lots, okay? That's what Purim is. I think one of the reasons we're celebrating that here is because it simply shows how the Lord works. And He can take even the most random events of life and make something out of them. He was able to save the Jewish people. He was able to put His man, Mordecai, in the spotlight. He was able to raise up Esther, take out Haman. He did it all randomly. Or so it would seem to us. Nothing with the Lord is random. Ironic at times, sure. But it just proves that even when there's no way out, the Lord can make a way. We just have to trust Him to open the door. So, with that, that's pretty much the book of Esther. Chapter 10 concludes with just saying who Mordecai was. And that's it. The Jewish people were saved. And God provided, even though we didn't see Him necessarily, He provided through His providence and His divine wisdom. So, with that, I will pray and you can be dismissed.